There's so much more research out now that really speaks to the fact that eating disorders are actually brain disorders. When we engage in eating disorders and develop them, there are actual neurobiological changes that happen that keep people stuck in their disorders. And particularly with anorexia nervosa, weight restoration over a period of time can reverse some of those neurobiological changes and can help us to get better.
Welcome to Coach Soul, the podcast where we explore therapeutic ways to the best versions of ourselves. I'm your host, Steve Hudgins. I'm a licensed professional counselor dedicated to helping you navigate life's challenges. In each uplifting episode, we'll discuss mental health, relationships, self-care, emotional well-being, and personal growth. Join me and with my co-host, Kenya Evelyn, a therapeutic life coach, where sometimes we'll even welcome special guests to our show that share their experience and expertise. So let's embark on this transformative path together and discover a healthier and happier you. All right, welcome back to part 2 with Mallary. Again, thank you for coming today. A fascinating story. Unfortunately, we're sorry for your mother's death. And as we spoke before, it's an ongoing process to deal with grief. And you took it to a controlling piece of your life now to where you kind of just stopped eating. And now that you're a parent, your dad tried to get help. And we left off with that question. You as a parent now have 2 children. Where's your thoughts on monitoring your children and things that they witness? I mean, surely, in Austin, Texas, we've recently had those floods in Kerrville and down in that area. A lot of death that has happened, unfortunately. Sometimes, as kids, we get impacted. I remember being in San Antonio. I was only 7 and I met a young man. He was a boy who was my age, but died in the hospital. And I never could grasp that. What do you say to parents?
Yeah, I think it's so challenging because for so long, parents were very often blamed as the sole culprits for eating disorders. And so oftentimes, mothers in particular were blamed for their children developing eating disorders. And we know that certainly parents can have influence, but we also now know that parents cannot categorically cause eating disorders. And so I think about this a lot as a mom of a 7-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter. And sometimes people will say, well, do you worry about this for your daughter? And I'll say, yes, but I also worry about it for my son. And I think that if you look at the statistics, it can feel a little bit daunting because research shows that females who have a relative with anorexia are 11 times more likely to develop the disorder themselves compared to individuals without a family history. And so this is no doubt a scary statistic for me, for other parents who may have struggled with an eating disorder. But I also think it's important to recognize that we don't inherit eating disorders. We inherit a vulnerability to them. So we're not doomed if we're the child of someone with an eating disorder, and our children are not doomed if we've had an eating disorder. And the geneticists who I've interviewed have talked about how there are genetic protective factors and genetic risk factors, but there's also environmental protective factors and environmental risk factors. And all those 4 factors really play into someone's likelihood of developing an eating disorder. So I know I can't control the genetic components, but I can have some control at least over those environmental factors. And I really try to think about what does that look like at home? And I think that parents can also be thinking about this as well. And sometimes it really is about the language that we're using to describe food and bodies. So for instance, in my household, I never refer to foods as good or bad or healthy or unhealthy. Part of the development of my eating disorder occurred at a time when I was taking a 7th grade health class where we were very much taught about good foods and bad foods. And as a people pleaser and perfectionist, I began to ascribe moral values to food and began to think, well, I'm good if I eat good food, but I'm bad if I eat bad food. And for children who have difficulty thinking through nuance, they often think in terms of these black and white ideas. And I never want my children to think that it's bad for them to eat quote unquote bad food or junk food. Certainly, I want them to have a well-rounded diet, but I also don't want them to demonize certain foods. And I want them to see me enjoying foods with them. So I do let them have candy. I take them out for ice cream. I eat the ice cream with them, even though there are some days where the eating disorders imprints still tell me I shouldn't, right? And so I try to model these behaviors of them seeing me enjoy food, even in moments where sometimes it feels like I'm faking it till I make it. I also don't put my body down in front of children. And I think that that's something for parents just to be cognizant of, because our society is so steeped in diet culture and fat phobia. And it is so normal for women in particular to talk about their weight or to talk about their appearance in a really negative way. And even when we think our children aren't listening, they are. And so it's really important to recognize that the messages we're sharing are getting through to our children. And so I really make it a point never to put down my body in front of my kids. And I really try to help my kids to appreciate what their bodies do for them and to see that their bodies are so much more than the way that they look. For my daughter's most recent birthday, I made her a mirror, and it was a wooden mirror that was in the shape of a flower. And on each petal, I wrote out different words and I painted them. But I put creative on one petal, and I put strong on another one, kind on one, smart, empathetic, right? All these different words that describe who she is as opposed to what she looks like. So when she can look in that mirror, she can think about everything that makes up her identity and who she is. And I think if we can help kids to recognize that their bodies carry them through this world, their bodies help them get through their days, and help them to take a more holistic approach to viewing their bodies and to viewing health, that can be really impactful, because all too often we equate health with just weight, right? And the number on a scale. And we only talk about it with regard to food, but it's also about getting rest. It's also about having time for play. It's also about treating our bodies with respect and listening to their bodies when they're tired or when they're hungry or when they're full. And I think kids have a more innate ability sometimes to listen to their body cues than we do as adults. And so I try to help my kids to recognize that. But I will say there's never a perfect way of going about it. And I certainly understand from parents' perspectives how difficult it can be. And I always refer to myself as a work in progress when it comes to parenting.
We're always a work in progress. Parenting is like a roller coaster. It's got twists and turns. Often we don't know what it feels like until we hit it. And so when you think about who you are, you kind of lost your identity. You discussed the bad and the good food, and here we are in today's culture where we're pushing back on the toxicity of food and, some of the bad dyes that are in the food that's causing some not so good health effects. When you're dealing with, these moments of good and bad, when you think about helping children's identity, did your dad help you to find yours?
I think he did in many ways, in the sense that he teach me this idea that we were supposed to kind of be strong in the face of adversity and that we were supposed to continue to move forward. I think I've always seen that as part of who I am. And I think it was to my detriment when I was younger. But in some ways, I think that it works as a strength now, because I think about this idea of just moving forward, but in a more authentic way, I would say. Sure. Just thinking, okay, I need to continue to move forward without trying to aim for perfection, but also move forward with an understanding that I need to acknowledge my emotions. I need to acknowledge times when I may slip and try to learn from those experiences. So I think in many ways, my dad laid a foundation for me that shaped my identity. But as I've gotten older, I have refined that foundation in different ways. And it has, I think, changed a little bit who I am and how I see the world. And so now I really think back on kind of who I am and how I came to be. And in many ways, I'm very different from my father. And sometimes I wonder where certain traits or aspects came from. But then I also look back on just how my father raised me. And I think, oh, okay, I understand why I am the way I am because of what he did or what he taught me along the way. He's very sensitive, and I grew up being very sensitive. That was a big part of my identity, and part of growing, right, as a person and expanding that identity has been trying to learn how to get better criticism, not taking things so personally. So I like to think that my dad shaped me. And as I've gotten older, I've also shaped myself into the woman who I want to be.
Identity is important. I do a lot of couples work, and oftentimes, in couples work, I hear women all the time saying, I don't know who I am anymore. Because oftentimes we either give in to what society or pressures are telling us that we should be, and it becomes challenging to push back. And so here you are, you have a dad that helped you through these things. When you think about this 11-year-old girl and what she went through, if you were able to go back to speak to yourself as an 11-year-old who just lost her mom, what would you say or might have said to ease your pain or change your path?
I would have definitely hugged my younger self and held her tight and told her, we can stay home from school for the week. We can just sit on the couch and cry our eyes out if we need to. We can look at pictures of mom together and share our memories of her. We can talk about how hard this is and how devastating it is. And we can talk about just that void that we just feel coursing through our bodies, right? And to really just hold space for that as opposed to burying it and shoveling it deeper down. I think I would have told myself that I didn't have to write the eulogy if I didn't want to, or that even though writing was helpful for me, maybe I could journal instead rather than feeling like I needed to put on this public display of strength. And so there's so many things I would have done to take care of younger Mallary. And I think part of what's been healing for me is in some ways reparenting myself and thinking about how can I mother myself now as a 40-year-old woman, but how through the writing process can I also think about this younger self and really empathize with her and recognize how hard it must have been for her. I think that process of reconnecting with my younger self was really critical in writing the book and in being able to kind of re-inhabit my younger self and what I was thinking and feeling at the time. So I've had to really get reacquainted with 11-year-old Mallary again to understand what that must have been like for her. And as a mom, I have so often wished I could just go back and hold her and tell her that I cared for her and that she was special and loved. Because if I think back to that time, I felt like I so often needed someone to just tell me that they cared for me and to tell me that I was special and loved. And certainly my father did that, but not in a very overt way. I think I really needed someone to just say, I'm here to take care of you during a really short time, and you are safe to cry and do whatever you need to do. And it wasn't honestly until I got sick with anorexia that I felt like I was finally getting attention, right? People were noticing I wasn't eating, I was losing weight, I was getting the kind of care and attention, although it was negative, that I really craved in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death. And so the eating disorder did give me that. I think it's important in recovery to recognize what our disorder perhaps gave us at one point, because it helps us to understand why we may have been drawn to the disorder in the first place. And so for me, looking back, I think it did give me that, even though it ultimately took so much away from me. But it's been really fascinating thinking back on that time and really reflecting on what I was like as a child and what I wish I could have done differently.
We always have that question of how do I wish I could have done something different? The knowledge that I have today, I could go back, but then we wouldn't be who we are today and impacting other people through what we've been through. When you think about what you're sharing about calling your inner self, this young child, and giving her permission to grieve. You wrote this book that's coming out in August called Slip. I see it back there in the background of your book, and that's amazing. How has writing, whether it's Slip or journalism work, served you as a form of therapy or spiritual practice for you?
So it's been incredibly helpful for me. I have always kept journals, as I mentioned. And even when I was in treatment, I meticulously journaled. And in many ways, those journals were heartbreaking to read through as an adult when I was writing my book. Felt like this emotional Mount Everest I was climbing as I read through these journal entries during my darkest times. But those journal entries were in many ways like a gift to my present day self because they helped me corroborate memory. They helped me to put together pieces of things that my memory may have not been as clear about. And they were really just helpful as I was writing more for my present day self. And my more recent writing for the book, I think, has really forced me in many ways to be as brutally honest as possible, because for many years I did write about my experiences with an eating disorder, but I always wrote those stories from the perspective of someone who was fully recovered because I thought that I needed to be fully recovered. And yet I didn't even really know what full recovery meant. And there was a brief period after I had left residential treatment as a teenager where I really thought, okay, I'm fully recovered. I've got this, but then ended up relapsing in college. And even during this period of relapse and this very sort of long, decade-long cycle of binge eating and restricting, I still told people I was fully recovered, and I was hiding all of those behaviors. And even in my writing, as I would talk about my experiences with an eating disorder, I would always refer to the disorder as something of the past. And so it wasn't until I really started writing this book and conceiving of it that I thought, what story do I want to share? And I said, I want to be as truthful and as authentic as possible. And if I'm being true to myself, I need to be able to recognize the fact that I'm not fully recovered. It wasn't until my late 20s where I finally was able to break free from that cycle of binge eating and restricting. And it was partly because I started to reframe my thinking around recovery as an ongoing work in progress rather than a perfectionistic ideal. And I started to see slips as opportunities for growth rather than grounds for failure. And so in writing this book, I thought that's what I need to be framing the story around, right? Recognizing that I don't have to be fully recovered to write this book. I can write this book as a woman in recovery, right? Not as someone who is recovered with a capital R. And I think that that felt like a real courageous act, but it also freed me up to write in the most honest way possible. And so writing this book has been so cathartic on so many levels because I've been able to really speak truth to this ongoing nature of recovery and to the messiness of recovery and the imperfections of it. And I think that that writing has ultimately really felt much more personal. And I think ultimately it's going to be a lot more relatable for readers, because in doing interviews with other people, I found that so many people experience this messiness of recovery and live their lives out in the middle place. But all too often, especially in the eating disorder field, we really take these black and white views, and it's very often thought that you're either acutely sick or you're fully recovered, and you could never live your life in between because you're somehow settling or you just aren't good enough. And I want to remove the stigma and shame that come with slips and really recognize that they're part of the process. And so writing for me has helped me to articulate my thinking around that and the messaging that I'm sharing with others.
So not only the book Slip has helped you to kind of heal per se, yes, we're still ongoing and trying to work on, not relapsing. One of the things I work with my clients is that I often bring out, here's where you've been, here's where you are, here's where you want to go. But how do you stop from going backwards again? Because it's a familiar territory. It's easy to slip back into that. Thus the book Slip. What is the primary message that you want to be able to bring out to your readers while they buy your book and start reading it? What would be the primary message maybe for our readers to understand, hey, this is something that may not interest me, but at the same point in time, it's about a grieving process, and the grieving process controlled you and smothered your identity. What message would you want to bring out?
So the message I would really want to convey is that we are all and always navigating some sort of middle place. I speak about it in the book largely with regard to eating disorders, but I think so many of us are in a middle place at some point in time, right? Whether it's the middle place of grief, even if the loved one has been gone for decades, right? We might still be in this middle place where we still feel the weight of that loss and we haven't arrived at closure. Maybe it is from an autoimmune disorder that we're struggling with, where we know I'm never going to be able to fully get rid of this, but it's something that I can manage, right? Or even with certain types of cancer, sometimes there is not necessarily cure, right? There isn't. It's something that we know could come back. It's still a vulnerability. And even talking with my 97-year-old grandmother recently, she said, I really love this idea of the middle place. She said, I feel like I'm trying to get to the middle, because she had lived in the same house for 70 years and recently had to go to a nursing home and was trying to figure out, how do I get to this place of acceptance? How do I sort of get to this middle place of recognizing that I'm never going to be fully okay with being in a nursing home, but I've got to be able to live with it and move forward despite that. And so I think that sometimes when people look at certain books, they think, well, I've never dealt with that, so that's not relatable to me. And folks may do that with my book, thinking, I've never had an eating disorder. That doesn't pertain to me. But I think that the beauty of writing this book has also been just exploring other universal truths around the middle place, around grief and loss, around parenthood. And all of those themes are woven into the book. And so I think that if we can give ourselves grace in these middle places we find ourselves in, then we can make meaningful progress forward. And that's a message that I really try to hit home in the book.
I appreciate you sharing that. And it's a powerful message, because when I think about what happens when control becomes something that's slowly destroying you, when you think about what you went through, is there something there that you feel like it's very important that people who may have family members that could have been you, what would you say to them to help them to get through these moments?
So I would say that in many ways, there is this idea that eating disorders are a choice. And I remember family members would tell me, why can't you just eat, or just step on a scale and you'll see that you're losing weight, or you're so smart, why can't you figure this out? And those comments came from both a place of love and frustration, but also from a place of just not really understanding my disorder. And there's so much more research out now that really speaks to the fact that eating disorders are actually brain disorders. When we engage in eating disorders and develop them, there are actual neurobiological changes that happen that keep people stuck in their disorders. And particularly with anorexia nervosa, weight restoration over a period of time can reverse some of those neurobiological changes and can help us to get better. But there are so many aspects of the disorder that are far beyond someone's choice. And so I think that parents need to recognize that. No one wakes up one day and decides that they want to have an eating disorder. So often people fall into these disorders and then can't get out of them. And so I think that really recognizing, for instance, if you're a parent and you see that your child is maybe not enjoying food as much, or they're isolating themselves, or they're missing meals, those are all warning signs that we need to heed, because I tend to talk about the middle place with regard to being this space in between sickness and full recovery. But I also think there's a middle place between someone's trigger and then the actual onset of an eating disorder and the diagnosis of one. And if we can catch people in that middle place before they actually descend into a full-fledged eating disorder, then we might be able to help a lot more people and potentially even save more lives. So I think that parents need to be cognizant of that middle place and recognize just how difficult these disorders can be, and really try to do their best to understand them. And part of why I wanted to write this book too was to give caregivers just a resource to better understand these disorders, because they can be very enigmatic. And I thought I knew a lot about eating disorders before writing this book, but I learned so much more through the process. And again, that also gave me more empathy for my younger self in terms of understanding why it was so hard for me to ultimately get better.
Mallary, I appreciate your truth. It's difficult to face the difficulties that we've been through, because we often want to hide from truth because it hurts. And one of the things that I think about as we close is that, loving yourself is not about fixing every flaw. It's about learning to live gently with the parts of you that once felt unlovable. And what I hear is that gentle, lovable piece for you. And so thankful for your book and experience of being able to share. And that's what Coach Soul is about. It's about learning how to coach your inner game to become a better you, so to speak. And so, Mallary, thank you for your heartfelt journey. It's been a pleasure. And so her book, Slip, is out on Amazon. Pre-order. It'll be available August the 5th. And so until next time, take care and God bless. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on Coach Soul. As we wrap up, we want to remind our listeners of a few key points. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content shared here is based on professional opinion but may not apply to everyone's situation. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your mental health care. If you're in a crisis, please seek immediate professional help or contact a crisis hotline. Listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship. For personal advice, please consult with your licensed mental health professional in your area. Remember, your mental health journey is unique. While we hope this information is helpful, it is crucial to work directly with the qualified personnel for your specific needs. Thank you again for tuning in to Coach Soul, and we'll see you next time.